And there we go, we're live. So we're still at 11. So we're still. Hello, everyone. As you're coming into the Zoom room, we're slowly admitting more participants as they come in. We're going to wait a couple more minutes before we begin our before we begin our presentation. We're about halfway there in terms of people who have pre-registered. And this is also just a reminder that we are streaming live on YouTube. So if you would like to be more anonymous, you're going to want to not show your video, or you may want to even change your name too. Those are all kind of personal preferences, but just so that you know, we are live on YouTube. This would be a good opportunity to offer any last guesses for the reveal of our new acquisition, if you might know what it is. If you're familiar with the chat function on your Zoom screen, you could place it there. You could privately message Jonathan or I with your answer, or you could share it with the whole group. Leave that up to your discretion. And there's definitely a lot of Hyde staff on this, so make sure we keep our secret. I don't know. You do know.
All right, I'll mute now. Hi, everyone.
All right, I don't see any more flooding in
Okay.
as we're getting to 6:35. And I'll be able to still admit participants as we're going, so we can get started whenever you're ready.
Right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jonathan Canning. I'm Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Hyde Collection, and I'm here this evening with my colleague, Jenny Hutchinson, Curator of Museum Education, to unveil an exciting new acquisition for the museum. Over the week, my colleagues and I in the Division of Curatorial Affairs and Public Programs, you saw Kerry Dudek, our assistant educator, keeping the secret just a moment ago. We've been posting recorded and live events all week as part of the fall fundraiser, Hyde at Home. And I'm delighted that tonight, as a sort of culmination of our Media Blitz week, we get to do something incredibly exciting. Sadly, it's virtual and remote, but we don't get too many acquisitions at the Hyde, and certainly not of this caliber. And so this is a very exciting evening for the curatorial staff in particular. But I'd like to first, before I reveal the painting, say a word about our benefactor. So I'm going to now take over your screens. We were all saddened in mid-March to hear of the death of Evelyn Muller, who had been a long-time trustee and supporter of the Hyde Collection. She had rolled off, as they say, the board in early 2018 after 18 years as a trustee. With her husband, Skip, she had been an indefatigable supporter of the museum. Together, they contributed generously to many of the major campaigns in the last 20 years that have transformed the Hyde, from the renovations and rehanging of Hyde House in 2024 to the opening of the new Fibers and Schmidt Gallery in 2017 that's to be dedicated to our modern and contemporary art collection. The bequest that we are unveiling tonight surprised me as curator. I wasn't expecting it. So I spoke with my predecessor, Erin Coe, and she told me that she had long admired this painting as it hung in Evie's dining room in New York. And she was pleased to learn that Evie had decided to donate it to the Hyde, as Erin called it, a major work. Now, it's the Hyde's practice with its credit lines that accompany every object we own as it hangs in a gallery, if it's lent to another museum, if it is illustrated in a book, that the credit line also name the donor. So it's fitting that Evie's name will always be associated with this incredible piece. And so to the painting itself. Oops, that's not working. There we go. It is a landscape by the American painter and printmaker George Bellows, called Freeman Young's Place on Martiniquez Island in Maine, and it was painted in 1916. And as far as I know, this painting has not been seen in a public exhibition since 1923. Bellows exhibited it several times between the date of its painting and 23, I think it, and then it was sold very shortly after Bellows's death in 1925. And then art historians, we simply lose track of it until now. Let's see. It's going to join our other Bellows in the East guest bedroom. So there you see our Bellows portrait of an old lady with bonnet, and the two are going to hang close together. Now, Bellows is better known for his portraiture, for his boxing paintings. So this is a somewhat unusual image, I think, in the public mind for what a Bellows looks like. And but I'm going to argue that, in fact, this is really very much a Bellows, and we need to broaden our understanding of who Bellows was, what he was about as a painter, and what his works look like. Now, Bellows grew up in Columbus, Ohio, born in 1882, and you see a photograph of him here with one of his famous boxing paintings as a backdrop. And recently he was the answer to a question in a crossword puzzle. And the question was, name an American painter who could have been a professional baseball player. Bellows was never intended to be a painter. Certainly it wasn't in the mind of his parents that he should become an artist. Bellows said that his mother wished him to be a bishop and his father planned for him to be the president of a bank. But in 1904, he persuaded his parents to let him drop out of his junior year at the Ohio State University and move to New York City to study at the New York School of Art under Robert Henry. And you see Henry on the left of your screen. Henry's an incredibly influential figure in American painting in the first half of the 20th century. He taught so many students in New York. And he was that type of inspirational teacher who didn't expect his students to necessarily adopt his own style of painting, but rather he motivated them to make their art relevant to the modern age. So teacher and students debated the nature of American realism or an American idiom within the realist tradition, be it in portraiture, landscape, or urban and genre scenes. Henry encouraged his students to paint what they saw on the streets of New York. And at the Hyde, we saw that in last year's summer exhibition with the John Sloan paintings and John Sloan's creation of a subset within urban painting of life on the rooftops of New York's tenements. Now, the extraordinary thing about Bellows is that within just a few years of moving to New York, he gets noticed by the critics. So remember, he moves to New York as a student in 1904, and by 1905, he's painted one of his most famous paintings, Shag at Starkey's. And critics went crazy for the vitality in this painting. Look at the sense of pent-up energy in the bodies, the curve of one boxer's torso, and the strength and energy in that straight line running through the other boxer. And then look at his use of red paint rawly applied in fresh, bold brush strokes where the two are pummeling each other. So that really caught critics' attention. And then 2 years later, he paints New York, this typical sort of, I mean, it's a cityscape that really captures the hustle and bustle of American enterprise. And so the critics praise Bellows early in his career for being able to create and to capture this vital new American spirit that they're so proud of. Henry, as a teacher and a painter in his own right, followed in the footsteps of Winslow Homer and went to paint on the coast of Maine. And Homer, I think you know Homer, famous for his later paintings of the granite shoreline of Maine, pounded by fierce Atlantic waves. And Homer's imagery quickly became a metaphor for American grit and determination, somewhat in contrast to the gentler, refined, they said, effete nature of European society, European taste, and European landscape. Henry often took his students with him, and Bellows traveled to Monhegan Island with Henry in 1911. And I think on the right, you can see a 1911 Bellows, and you can see his debt to Homer, and that vision of how the harsh, hard setting of the Maine coast can represent something about the American spirit. Another of Henry's students who traveled to Maine at this time was Rockwell Kent. And Kent first went in 1905, and actually he spent a whole year. Kent was captivated, challenged by the hard life of the Maine fishermen on Monhegan Island. He stayed a whole year. He hand built his own cabin. He learned to fish, work as a trawlerman, and he painted these bold, strong, modern landscapes or seascapes of Maine, and exhibited them for the first time in New York in 1907. Bellows saw that exhibition, and he's quoted as saying that he was going to do better ones when he got to Maine. So that's 1907. It takes him 4 years, but you can see here's Bellows. He's responding to Toilers of the Sea by Rockwell Kent. The composition is very close. It's a homage to his contemporary, Bellows and Kent, born in the same year. But you know, there's a rivalry there Bellows has in his mind, and he's made this painting, Evening Swell, as a response and a challenge to his contemporary Kent. So this is this rather dark, grey-toned painting is sort of what we're used to when we think of landscapes by Bellows. But Bellows returns to Maine several times. He goes back in 1911, 1913, he goes back in 1913, 1914, and then in 1916, the year of our painting. And in that year, he traveled to Camden. You can see Camden up in the north of the map on the Maine coast. And he was there for the summer with his family. He painted a new scene of shipbuilding, traditional shipbuilding. And then in September, he sent the children back to New York, and he and his wife traveled to Matinicus Island. It's marked in red on the map. And then they went also to Creehaven, which is now known as Ragged Island. So it's just south of Matinicus. And they spend September and part of October on the two islands. Matinicus Island now has about 74 inhabitants. In the early 1900s, it had probably twice that number. But it was quite a hard life on the island. And I've been able to find out a little about Freeman Young, whose farm Bellows painted. And I've used largely the US Census to ferret out this information. So Freeman Young was born in 1872. He was the youngest child of William and Lizzie Young. So born in 1872, he's 10 years older than Bellows. Freeman's father, William, was listed in earlier censuses as a fisherman, and then in his later years as a farmer. William died in 1905 when Freeman inherits the small freeholding. In the 1910 census, Freeman is listed as a lobster fisherman. But by 1920, he's abandoned Matinicus Island as many did. He moved to the mainland, to Rockland, started or continued there as a fisherman, but later in life he spends several decades as a real estate agent and dies in 1966. So that little history of Freeman Young has given you time to really look at this painting. And I want to show you two other paintings that Bellows painted in that year, 1916, while he's on Matanicus and then Creehaven. So there's Ox Team Wharf at Matanicus, which is now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. And then there's this rather free and fresh work, The Romance of Creehaven, that's in San Francisco. And what's so striking here is Bellows's use of bright colors. It's just not what we expect of him. In a 2012 exhibition on Bellows at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., curator Charlie Brock argued that we have an inaccurate idea of Bellows's style and Bellows's interests as an artist. And this is because Bellows died young. He died at 43 from acute appendicitis. And that caused critics and art historians to emphasize his earlier paintings, the works like the boxing scenes, the urbanscapes that had first garnered attention for the young artist, and to rather underappreciate the later works, the series that we see from 1916 on Matanicus Island, in part because as art historians, we're not really sure where this was ultimately to go, because Bellows never quite created that mature style and settled into sort of a style in his mature years that would really come to define him. He just didn't live long enough. In taking up this colorful palette, Bellows is responding to movements in European art. And the seminal moment is the 1913 Armory Show. Bellows is one of the organizers of this event, in which, without too much discrimination or favor, American agents just brought over a diverse range of European painting and movements and styles, from realism at the mid-19th century all the way to Cubism. Picasso's nude descending a staircase was one of the paintings at the Armory Show. But we've got two here that were, I think, influential on Bellows in a way. We have Seurat's Les Poseurs. So here we have the Americans for the first time experiencing pointillism and the understanding of optics and color that was emerging in Europe. And we also have Derain's Le Port d'Anvers, the Port of Antwerp, a Fauvis. Actually, this isn't Derain. This is, it's my mistake. This is Georges Braque. This is Braque, Georges Braque, working in a Fauvis style before he became a Cubist. That's bad art history 101 on my part. I apologize for that. But it's an example of Fauvism, of the bright, bold use of color underway in Europe. And to discuss more of that aspect of Bellows's painting, I'm going to hand over now to Jenny. So thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. As we transition our screens here, let's see, I'm gonna have to pay attention to my controls a little bit. So, there we go. Do we see the Armory Show up?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So my background or my expertise is in painting. I got my master's of fine arts in painting. So that's part of why Jonathan's invited me to speak today. Because in this artwork, in our new artwork, Bellows is working with a pretty complicated method, which I'll explain in my following presentation here. One of the things that I want to do first, though, is touch a little bit more back on the importance of the Armory Show. It's a pivotal point in art history. And the reason why is because in the decades that precede it, we really witnessed the revolution in artistic practice that defined this very show and write the manifestos of modern art theory. So it's a very pivotal moment, not just for the European artists placing their artworks on display, launching it onto their American stage, but it changes the course of how American artists are responding to the ways that they're making their art as well. American art in this time period kind of sits at the edges of the limelight. Art finds emphasis in the excitement of these European modernists who have now newly moved to the shores of the United States. And as a result, the capital of art even moves from France to New York. So there's a great deal of transformation that's happening kind of over these kind of early parts of the 20th century. Art of this time was defined by a universal manifestation among artists to seek the truth in art. They wanted to know the kind of purest, most truthful way to express themselves. And that's very much a characteristic of the modern period for both European and American artists. That influence develops from the preceding decades that were preoccupied with a great deal of change. So we have revolutions that birthed new governments, industrialization that transformed landscapes and the very ways of life. And we witnessed the atrocities of war on a world scale. So there's a lot going on in the world. And as a means to cope, artists are finding footing in this new identity, and they become preoccupied with individualism and find solace by defining a new vocabulary to mark their place in art history. In summary, the world changed dramatically, so art changes dramatically. In this next slide, I'm going to kind of start to speak to how artists are finding this new language. So it involves experimentation that's rooted in artistic practice. Artists are applying the scientific method to art practice. And from this, new discoveries are going to be made. Artists are pioneering a new language that's preoccupied with the very elements of art. So they're creating a vocabulary of line, of color, of shape, value, and texture. For Bellows and the school of artists he participated with, they're more rooted in developing this language through color theory, and shifts in composition are also at the forefront of their research. Color theory is rooted in the optics of color, how one sees color, and how one can be affected by color. And artists entertain how they can create a system of control using a sequence of color. This system also can apply to the rules of composition. So composition meaning how elements are arranged within a piece. So that brings us to our Bellows here. So color and composition are utilized specifically to create the effect of the sublime or other desired psychological tone. These are not new philosophies in the modern period or in the history of art, so to say. The Renaissance was greatly preoccupied with the application of divine proportions. And there really isn't one art movement that hasn't developed a series of symbols defined by color. They all kind of have mechanics of this in some way or some form. But in summary, the lesson of modern art is that artists pair observation with artistic practice to create a physical or psychological response. They're looking to create that language using only line, only shape, or only color. And we see color very much featured in this work by Bellows. For all these reasons, I often joke with our tour groups that the fault of modern art isn't that we can't understand it, but the miscommunication is found in an artist's pursuit to create this visual language. And we as the viewer have to figure out what language the artist is speaking in. But that can be difficult because not all of us speak artist, right? So that's where museums and art historians and theorists can help us out, because we can help illuminate or unveil that language. As Jonathan mentioned, Bellows was a student of Robert Henry, and both adopted color principles developed by a color theorist, specifically H.G. Murata. I've also been joking lightly that I've come to consider H.G. Murata as a bit of a Bob Ross type figure. And I don't say that to not provide emphasis to his expertise, but I say that because he was passionate about the theory of art. And with that, he was equally interested in developing a universal method to be adopted by others. And he also even develops his own paint line that he sells to others. So in that way, I find him kind of similar. And I always like to draw some contemporary correlations, even humorous ones. These ideas of color theory that I'm about to present, developed by Murata and his contemporaries, are not original ideas. Scientists such as Kepler, Newton, Helmholtz, and even composers such as Debussy and Scriabin also investigated these same theories. But there's a reason why no one cracks this system, Murata included, and through the following presentation, I'll illuminate why. So here's an example of, and this is actually from one of Murata's notebooks, of what they were trying to do. So they were trying to link the system of 12 colors from the color wheel and link them to the 12 intervals of the Western music scale. Seems practical, right, in some respects, if we consider that both sound and color can be expressed as waves, which can be measured in hertz, and both sound and light, which we're talking about visible light, can be described from wave physics, where speed equals frequency times wavelength. That I had to Google. I'll be honest about that. So what I'm showing you is kind of just example of how those wavelengths might look from the red part of the spectrum all the way to the violet, and then also how we may see frequencies of sound and how we can begin to apply that to spectrums of color within the system. In Murata's system, what they're looking to do is to specifically link the composition of color with the composition of music with use of piano keys. This is definitely a bit of a faulty method because the keys of the piano and the sounds that those notes create cannot always adequately correspond when linking to a musical scale and corresponding to color. Color scheme and musical tone can really only connect through abstract methods. So it starts to get back to that like subliminal language that artists are speaking in, that we have to know what they're talking about in order to understand. Because it's very much subjective to the artist or the musician to create that scale. However, what can happen is if we consider that music is a summary of intervals between notes over an amount of time, when applying this concept to the color wheel, what we'll see is a sequence of color, when composed in a certain way, can produce harmony and dissonance or contrast. This happens visually, and that's very similar to the way notes can combine to create harmony or dissonance in sound. So let's entertain this abstract theory using Murata's example here to consider how the sequence of music intervals and the location of colors on the color wheel correspond to this amazing work by Bellows. But before I do that, I'm going to break down a little bit more specifically Murata's color theory so that you can follow me in my examples. The first point, and this is true for any artistic method considering color theory, is we have 6 colors from nature that correspond to the color wheel. And we're talking about kind of the major primaries and secondaries. So we're saying red, orange, yellow, blue, green, and violet. Indigo is removed because we're applying it to the color spectrum. So we're not talking about light anymore. We're specifically talking about pigment. The difference between light and pigment is another point that I'll address in a moment, but really that's a whole other lecture that we don't have to apply to this presentation. Part of the color wheel is also the hues that are in between these primaries and secondaries. When primaries and secondaries are mixed together, those are our tertiary hues. So that's like our red orange, our yellow orange, our yellow green, our blue green, our blue violet, and our red violet. This is what creates those full 12 intervals of color that can correspond to the 12 intervals of piano keys. As you move along the color wheel and along the piano keys, as Murata has showed us here, he begins to assign those colors that are next to one another. So we have red, red, orange, 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 yellow. I've got design cemented in my brain, and we usually say the primary first. And then it moves along down the piano keys. So the important part to keep in mind here is that he's assigning these colors based to the piano keys. And then what he's going to do with that is create color systems or schemes based upon these arrangements of colors to create visual harmony or to create visual contrast. And one of the ways in which they do that is through these consistencies of arrangements. So specifically, we're looking at colors that are next to each other on the color wheel that have the most ability to have harmony with one another, whereas the dissonant arrangements are going to be opposite of these colors on the color wheel. So that's kind of how we're looking at it. We're looking at colors next to each other, and then we're looking at colors that are opposite from one another and how they work together. So Murata develops these concepts in 1911. And that's when Bellows learns these concepts from his teacher, Robert Henry. So now let's consider this artwork in relation, these principles in relation to this artwork. I'm also going to mention here that this is purely speculation based upon writings by Murata and Bellows by Bellows' mentor, Robert Henry, that I've taken a look at. Both were avid note takers. Bellows was not. So I'm kind of theorizing here based upon those notes. I don't specifically know for sure that this is exactly what Bellows was thinking. So the first thing we have to do is we have to consider the key of a color. That's how we first start to assign this to our piano keys. So in one way in which you do that is you kind of look at the major kind of emphasis of color within a piece. So the two colors that really pop up to us, mainly due to these cows, is orange and yellow. So I'm going to show you the examples of how I've assigned these to these keys. So in the key of orange, corresponding to our musical intervals, this is maybe what Bellows' code looked like. Now in the key of yellow, we're kind of moving, two down, and then the rest of the colors fall in. Now, one of the things that Murata also says about these color chords or color intervals or the keys of colors is that the majors are the emphasis of focal points. So the majors being, I've highlighted in red, are C, E, and G. So in the key of orange, that's orange, green, and blue, violet. In the key of yellow, that's yellow, blue, and red, violet. Now, if we look at these bottom colors here, both blue, violet, and red, violet, and then we look to our artwork, you'll notice that red, violet, and blue, violet, though there, are very kind of minor parts of the composition. They're integral parts of the composition, but they're not the major focal points. They're not like these cows or this yellow or this orange or even this green that cascades everywhere. So this told me that I wasn't quite working in the right key. So then I developed the key of red orange, and then I've unlocked the code because the majors then are red orange, yellow green, and blue, which very much make up and encompass the entirety of the scene. Likewise, the other thing that Murata and Bellows and Henry entertain is that you can create chords of color. And that's where we start to get into the nitty-gritty kind of components of like harmony and contrast. And these are the chords that I've highlighted here, both in blue and in red. So we have the color chord of orange, yellow, and green, or red, orange, and yellow, green. These are notes of harmony. That's also what makes up a large part of our foreground here and midground. And then we have, conversely, we have blue, violet, and red. And then we also have blue, green, blue, violet, and violet, red. All of those kind of sit in our background. So this also kind of nicely fits into kind of the color principles that Murata has developed for us. The other thing that leads me to think about this is between 1915 and 1916, Bellows, Henry, John Sloan, Randall Davy, and Charles Weiner expand upon these principles by hosting a series of important meetings in which they kind of develop or like more closely focus on these principles. And one of the things that they begin to develop, and I'm going to skip ahead here, is to this slide right here, is they expand upon the way in which they even assign saturation. And if you're kind of keeping track of some of the dates that I've assigned here, 1915, 1916, that also nicely aligns with the date of this piece. So that's another reason why I think Bellows is working within this color scheme, is because it kind of lines up all the theories. So within these meetings between 1915 and 1916, what they do is they expand upon how they assign saturation. So I've summarized it here rather than showing an example because it's quite in depth. Numbering of a color could be ranked from 1 to 13, 13 as the most intense. They also assigned subscripts of P, 1, or S, which meant practical, referring to a color as being flexible. Degrees of intensity are applied to atmospheric perspective. So they assign foreground, midground, or background. So based upon those principles, below the image here, I've kind of created a fake formula, so you would say, just to kind of illustrate how they were thinking about color. So yellow-green, for example, very saturated. That might have been assigned a subscript of 13, followed by red-orange, still pretty bright, but not as bright as our green here. Maybe that's like in the 8 category, followed along with yellow, also pretty bright, followed by green, which is in the 5 range here in the midground, with some blue-green, and also some red-orange that starts to become even more dull, so it's less intense. And then we start to get into those P values, which is the red, violet, and violet, or that's how I'm going to assign it, because those are the things that sit kind of deeply into our background. Again, this isn't a definitive calculation, but it's a good way to illustrate maybe how these artists are thinking about color, or how they're expanding upon how saturation is arranged to composition. The other thing to keep in mind here is, oops, sorry, I've gone too far. I'm going to go back to the color wheel here. Is one of the other things that Murata thinks about is the purity of a color. So how much is a color of itself without adding another color from the color wheel to it? Meaning it starts to resemble, so if we start with red, when does it start to resemble red violet or red orange? And these pure hues are considered the most saturated or the most vibrant. So when creating a color key or color chord, this becomes very important because what Murata says and what Bellows follows is basically that the most pure hues of these colors should occupy your foreground, which ours do here. And those are also the elements that are going to appear closer to us. You also see that with this blue right along the top. That's the most kind of pure state of that blue, and it represents the sky that is nearer to us. Whereas everything else, as it gets more dull, it starts to kind of sit more completely into the background or midground. So it's a way to align space. It's a little bit overcomplicated, similarly to Murata's theories, but you know, it's all very interesting in terms of how this goes to kind of mark this this piece's time and history, and then also relate to all these different principles that these artists are thinking about. The next thing I'm going to talk about, or last thing I want to mention in relation to these principles, is over the course of Bellows' career, as Jonathan mentioned, he had very distinct color systems that each related to his 3 campaigns and paintings. So his paintings of 1911 were very similar to one another. His works produced between 1916 and 1917 were all very similar to one another. They all had these very vibrant, bright color palettes. And his works produced between 1923 and 1924 are also very similar to one another. Bellows was by no means a very regimented artist, as much as his contemporaries anyway. He was the most flexible. Deviation and experimentation are visible throughout his career. And in this work, we can see he's equally influenced by another color theorist of the time, who I'm not going to get too in depth with his theories, is Percival Tudor Hart, who also aspired to link color with music, but he was more preoccupied with linking tone and color with sensation. So you started to get into properties illustrated by like Wadsley Kandinsky. Tudor Hart also adopted the theory that one could solely rely upon color and shape to express form that would align with the properties of atmospheric perspective. And you didn't need line to emphasize this or illustrate this. And that's where we see Percival Tudor nicely connected to Bellows' work here, is because he's relying upon shape and color to create this atmospheric perspective. So that's my full analysis in terms of color. Probably very in depth, but I hope you learned a little bit more, and I've opened your eyes as to how you might be able to look at different color schemes of paintings in the future. The last thing that I'm going to mention more briefly is the composition. And one of the things that Bellows, Henry, and Murata were doing at the same time that they were developing their theories of color is they were also linking this to composition. So I'm going to skip ahead to my last slide and show you what I mean by that. So these complicated lines that you see here basically relate to the golden section or golden ratio and golden spiral. And here are all the different ways in which I was able to take Bellows' use of these principles related to the golden section, the golden ratio. He also liked to do these golden divisions that you see kind of come across different parts of the golden section here. And you start to see a lot of things line up. And I'm going to point out a couple of my favorites. So the first is beginning up here in this corner. We start to see this line go all the way down, and it intersects perfectly in the middle of this cow's back. And then it exits right through the eye of this cow here. So he's kind of perfectly aligned these elements diagonally across the image here. The other thing you might notice is how the golden ratio perfectly fits kind of the interior body of this cow, like right in its midsection. You also might notice that the top of this, the top of these cows kind of closely align one another. This isn't like an exact, like I haven't placed these lines exactly according to math, so they might shift in space a little bit. But it's not just shapes in the composition that they're trying to line up with in terms of edges. They're also looking at it in terms of shadow. So shadow and highlight, which we see illustrated here with this cow too. So on one side of the line, he's got this great, beautiful shadow going on. That's yellow and purple mixed together. And then on the other side, right down that line, he's got this beautiful kind of highlight that's corresponding to the cow as well. So, I'm sure as you're looking, you're finding other relationships that you've been able to surmise, or find. But in any case, this is basically how Bellows, in summary, was applying color theory to composition. All right. And let's see, I'll stop my screen share. All right. Does anyone have any questions for Jonathan and I?
Let me, I don't know if you can see, but here's, this is a Bellows catalog from the 1990s. And you can see that here are 2 pages printed in the 19 teens, in which artists are looking at all of these proportions, diagonal lines, verticals, horizontals. I mean, Bellows and his colleagues really did dissect paintings in the way that Jenny was doing at the end.
Yeah.
So if I could take back screens and move on. As a conclusion, our new Bellows, our tremendous new Bellows, is going to hang, as I said, in the East guest bedroom, and it's going to hang in the company of our Seurat. And that's so important because it relates Bellows to European developments in color and theory and optics. It relates Bellows as an artist and modernist to the Armory Show. As I showed, Seurat was one of the artists represented. Also in our East guest bedroom is an Arthur Bowen Davies portrait. Arthur Bowen Davies was, along with Bellows, one of the organizers of the exhibition. There hangs in, as we saw, the Bellows portrait, Lady with a Bonnet. And that speaks across the bedroom with an oil sketch by Thomas Eakins. So we really have the realist tradition from about 1880 to 1916 in American art represented in this gallery. And Eakins was a revolutionary figure in his generation. And then Bellows is one of the revolutionary figures within the idiom of American realism within his generation. And that's, as you travel through Hyde House and the collection that Mrs. Hyde put together, is the end point of that collection. But as Jenny has shown with her analysis of color theory and structure within the painting, take out realism and think now in terms of abstraction. So you can now, with this painting, we encourage our visitors to walk out of Hyde House and the humanist realist tradition within which Mrs. Hyde collected, and move then into the Fibers and Schmidt Gallery, our permanent collection of mid 20th century abstraction and beyond, where color and composition, line and structure have been freed from needing to appear as something in this world, and can be freely worked with by artists like Grace Hardican, Bridget Riley and others. So in so many ways, this painting is so important to the story of Western art that we tell at the Hyde Collection. I can't tell you how excited I am that it has come into the collection, how grateful I am to our beloved Evie Muller, who through over decades really was a tremendous supporter of the Hyde, valued its contribution to the cultural life of the North Country, and has made this permanent contribution to the work of the Hyde. And I'm sure it's going to become very quickly one of the favorite paintings in the collection. So as I said at the beginning, this is the culmination of a week of media events that my friends and colleagues have been posting. It's part of our fall fundraiser called Hyde at Home. And so a final plug, our online auction closes sharp tomorrow night, 9 p.m. You've got just over 24 hours to make final bids for the objects that are for sale, but also you can make direct contributions to exhibitions, public programs, and the infrastructure and general operating needs of the Hyde. All I can say is this has been an incredibly challenging year for the Hyde. As for all cultural and nonprofit institutions, we really dearly need your help and support. We appreciate it very much. I really do want to thank you for joining us this evening. I hope you will be able to come to the Hyde very soon and see the painting. It is up on an easel, the way Mrs. Hyde used to introduce new pieces to her collection, in the East Guest bedroom, visible tomorrow morning, starting at 10 o'clock if you are a senior, noon if you are younger. But we hope to see you at the Hyde soon, and I hope that you'll see the freshness, the vitality, and enjoy the color and exuberance of this painting when you visit us. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, you're welcome.